formed by ongoing tradition, and how many actually sidestep the Indigenous cultures that have emerged from, or shall I say survived, horrific colonial histories. For my family, Noongar and Yamaji peoples from the southwest Midwest bloc, areas of early colonial contact and dispossession, a lot of our traditions, our languages, our iconography and our making practices were lost. It is true that some are being revived today and members of our community, but for others, surrendering to the fact that this heritage has now fallen into a state of endless freefall within the colonial abyss is the only way that we can move forward. I have never spoken language. My father has never spoken language. My grandmother has never spoken language. It is truly lost for us, and that loss is central to our identity. To relearn it can be as painful as never having had it. I guess what I'm trying to point out here is that contemporary museums, in the case of my family, continue to be tools of cultural violence through their presentation styles, the choices of exhibition programming, the stories they choose to share or they choose to omit. In this way, they have a great capacity to keep our wounds open. For larger collectives of people who have shared experience, abominable experience, such as the stolen generations in Australia, there seems to be an obligation to share these stories, which of course need to be shared. But it seems that for museums, social obligations even tend to be curated. But who's curating them? So with this in mind, I find myself questioning, can non-Indigenous museums ever really be places for all Indigenous people? Or does the trend of only sharing seemingly authentic cultures who have preserved their traditions to the exclusion of others mean that for us, we will never see our stories occupy these spaces? Can the stories, cultures and identities of families like ours, and there are so many families just like ours, ever have a meaningful place in Australian museums? Having used the WA Museum as my case study, you see our experience is uniquely Western Australian. I should point out that having worked for the new museum project, for the WA Museum for 2 years, I have faith that some of the things I've pointed out thus far in my presentation will be resolved in the new museum. Sorry. So, back to my journey. I got a little bit older. I didn't really have the same interests anymore. I was a young kid riding my bike, exploring the landscape I was living in, making friends, going to school, doing all that stuff. And so museums really weren't an interest. And then I had to grow up quickly, losing my grandmother, my pop, 2 of my cousins and my mother within a 7-year period. Again, museums weren't a priority. These were places, weren't a priority. It wasn't until I began at university that I started to appreciate museums in new ways. These places could take me home in many ways. The objects within them were portals to memory and association, and I needed this now living in a city and feeling quite detached from Aboriginal culture and people. I could reconnect to my past, but through the objects in these museums, I wasn't reconnecting to my mob. So there was a distance in the viewing and the connecting that I was experiencing. So I went on to study fine arts at the university with no intention of ever becoming a curator. In fact, if you had have asked me 15 years ago, I would have said something really cocky like, what a bureaucratic sellout. Things have changed. So after completing my degree, I had a good run as an exhibiting artist, and I was appointed as the Associate Curator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art at the Art Gallery of Western Australia, which you can see, this lovely brutalist building over here. This moment changed the direction of my professional career, and I was now on the inside, and I really wanted to make my mark. For me, moving into a curatorial role within an art gallery signalled an exciting change professionally. It offered me the opportunity to work with visual arts and cultural artefacts in exciting ways. All of my experiences at the gallery were rich and rewarding, and over a 7-year period I developed a new craft, integrating my own ideas, understandings of architecture and space, and cultural methodologies, bringing together exhibitions of Indigenous Australian, European and American art, both historical and contemporary. I was host curator to a large exhibition, Cultural Warriors, a National Indigenous Art Training from the National Gallery of Australia, Larrakitch from the Kerry Stokes collection, which was a significant body of Yolngu material from northeast Arnhem Land, and an international collaboration with the Museum of Modern Art on an exhibition titled Van Gogh, Dali and Beyond, the World Reimagined. This show traced the emergence of modernity from Europe and America. So these were all great opportunities. I'll always be grateful for them. However, I'd be remiss to not share with you that in my 7-year employment, Not one of my exhibition proposals was supported for development or delivery as an exhibition. I'm sure that each of you can understand how disillusioning this experience can be. Putting ego aside, I was able to, through acquisitions into the collection, invest quite a lot of money into Indigenous communities. This had an immediate impact in the lives of makers and artists, while simultaneously contributing to a cultural legacy that will outlive all of us, the artists who made the work, and everyone here today, all being well, global warming, international conflict, and the general state of the world. So like all parts of life, you win some, you lose some. And for me, asking myself the question, why am I here? Who am I here for? Provided enough fuel for me to keep going forward, even when I wanted to bail. So now, more of the good stuff I did at the gallery. I had a really great privilege of curating 2 consecutive West Australian Indigenous Art Awards in 2010 and in 2011. For all the curators in the room, you know the moment after the opening where you go, oh, I wish I could fix that, or I wish I could do that differently. Well, having this opportunity to do things differently enabled me to kind of sort of pare that back a little bit and fix the things that I wasn't quite happy with. The awards were the richest in the country at the time, and what was unique about them is that artists were asked to submit a body of work over a 2-year period which best exemplified the work they were doing, so it wasn't a prize with one single work. And this allows you to see more into the worlds from which the work emerges. You're able to see more of an artist's practice. And I think that's a really interesting model. Unfortunately, that award is no longer. For me, what was of great value, cultural and curatorial importance within the process, was that I had the opportunity to travel to remote communities, cities and towns, and meet with artists, and a chance to make sense of their work in relationship to the social, political and cultural landscapes they were operating within. This has always been felt inherent in sharing art, as displaying Indigenous art without its story, without offering artists a voice, without honouring the deep attachment and responsibility to culture and country, or the intense and powerful politics of work emerging from artists working outside of custodial tradition, seemed an injustice to both the artist and the audience. There are, of course, artists who believe their works speak for themselves, or who want viewers to make meaning of their work through their own worldview, and as a curator you have to respect this. But there are a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists who are natural storytellers, and who, if you give them the opportunity, wish nothing more than to share with you the worlds from which their work emerge. After all, and it's the moment of making, these are the places artists go, and the end result isn't that significant. The attachment to what informs this art is significant, not the way it manifests into the world. In 2010, I applied for a fellowship at the National Gallery of Australia and proposed to do something really interesting for me, to go and work with artists and think about elevating voice and giving artists first-person voice within interpretation in art galleries. I was lucky to work on a show curated by a dear friend of mine, Carly Lane, the second National Indigenous Art Triennial, Undisclosed. Serendipitously, a number of artists in Carly's exhibition were also featuring within the West Australian Indigenous Art Awards. So off I went, travelling the country, digital SLR, tripod and audio recording gear in my backpack, conducting interviews and being welcomed into people's homes, their art centres, meeting their families on places they call home, and in many instances on their traditional country. The notion was that this content, although important for intended audiences, could in fact be more important for communities and artists. It could connect communities to the exhibitions which featured their collective cultural material. Not all Australians have access to big city galleries and museums, so being able to connect communities with exhibition programs in digital ways seemed necessary to ensure that the gallery was actually being inclusive. After all, many Indigenous artists are conduits to the narrative. They don't own the narrative, but instead are custodians during their lifetime. Enabling all custodians, beyond the individual artist, to share in this experience of their shared cultural material seemed only fair. So I'll share a few images with you of the iBook in a moment, but I'll just give you a sense. This is Nyapa Nyapa Yunupingu. She's a Yungu artist from Northeast Arnhem Land, and she was in the show I was curating and in the other show which I made this iBook for. So I'll show you a video of her. Nyapa Nyapa spent the day telling me lots of information that wasn't quite appropriate for her videos, so we decided to take a different approach with her. This was about removing the exotic other It's about giving a face and a process to a work of art for audiences. In Arnhem Land, if people don't have access to real hair for their hairbrushes, they often cut it off their dogs, which is really cute. This is a work of Gwimbi Ganambard. In terms of incorporating worldview into visual arts presentation, Yulun people have a moiety system where everything belongs to Irija or Dua. So in bringing his work together, we decided to represent that in two different plinths, which show those two balanced worlds together. And he won the award that year. So it was a really interesting thing when you start curating with community, not for them, how that changes things. Okay, so the awards exhibition, let me just show you actually, I'll show you a few of the little screen grabs from the iBook which you can all download. So it had essays within it. It showed artists on their country and had video interviews of them with talking about their work. It had photos of their families and you know, the work in situ in the gallery as well. So the awards exhibition of 2011, the second I curated paired with the iBook, was, while I was undertaking a fellowship, signalled a development in my practice, a commitment to collaborative exhibition making and storytelling, and a commitment to crafting exhibitions and projects which leave meaningful legacies for communities, beyond a colourful catalogue written in English and a trip to the artist for opening night. By excluding integral knowledge systems and first-person interpretations of objects and artworks, and instead offering an interpretation from a seemingly superior authoritative curator and their viewpoint. At this point I realised that even the white box gallery treatment, although visually striking and able to facilitate rich engagement with works of art, also created otherness through its omission of any voice other than the curatorial voice. The practice of inserting a mediator between audience and artists sometimes created an unnecessary distance and could in fact reinforce notions of the exotic other, as if an explanation from the artist or a community member about the work would not hold its own merit, that it needed extra layers of curatorial voice applied to make the work accessible to audiences. As a curator, having spent much time working in these modalities of interpretation, in retrospect I would have done things differently. I would have liked to move beyond the label, beyond the didactic. Now that sounds like a great title for my next paper, doesn't it? As a curator, having worked in these ways, which are standard practice, or some may even say best practice around the world in art museums, I have to acknowledge it's a hard task to sum up the dreaming, our times of creation, in a wall text, or to wrap up the colonial experience of Indigenous Australia in 200 words. In having a go, often what you're left with are light-on, summarised versions of complex cultural narratives, social issues and politics. As my partner would say, a highly qualified doctor, what you end up with is a whole lot of incomprehensible arty gobbledygook. Mind you, his scientific mind often works in ways that I don't quite understand either. So ideally, a curator would travel to meet with artists and walk through and talk through the narratives of their work. But money, time and the tyranny of distance have restricted this invaluable engagement in Australia, on the Australian continent for some time. These factors are amplified if you are writing about work emerging from remote communities. So often it's cheaper to fly to Berlin than it is to get to a remote community. Often your source material for your writing or your interpretation might come in the form of an artwork certificate from the art centre. These are often written by non-Indigenous art centre managers, often without translation services in place to ensure true reflection of artistic intent and cultural narrative. For some works, it's true that the knowledge embedded within them is too sacred for public consumption and restricted to initiates of communities. But this is not the case for all the work. Everyone involved in this chain of interpretation is of course well-meaning, doing their job in underfunded environments, advocating for greater representation and visibility of Indigenous art, culture and reality. But some of these processes are problematic in terms of the politics of voice, cultural agency and autonomy. Equally, they are problematic in a gallery or museum's role in accurate presentation. in conveying cultural information that emerges from custodians, not through interpretations provided by someone who sits on the outside of someone's culture. If we think about it, it's kind of like this interpretive material is being written 10 metres away from the cultural window, on a rainy day, through foggy windows. It's quite the onion of cultural obscurity, isn't it? It was these reflections on the industry and its processes that encouraged me to try to find ways to elevate and give immediacy to the artist's voice in any way I could. After a good run at working in a large art institution, doing some meaningful work, and many learnings about the industry, curatorship, and the complexities of the art world, it was time for a change. What I discovered in this time was the art world that I was most compelled to, most comfortable in, and most challenged by is at the source. A place of making, a place of working with artists in their country or in their studios, talking about ideas, place, ancestors, family, and life. To this day, the shows I love to curate are the ones with immediacy, where a curator can work with artists, makers, and writers in ways that are assertive and reactive. I've been able to do a few of these kinds of shows outside of large institutions, and one big learning for me was that what I can do inside an institution is completely different than what I can achieve working outside of one. Adjusting my expectations around this has been central to keeping stress levels manageable. Mind you, I'm not saying that I don't think our non-Indigenous institutions don't need to change. They most certainly do. Otherwise, we people, Indigenous people, might just start to build our own spaces in the world, to do our own work. Perhaps indigenising our spaces might free us from our obsession with decolonising the spaces of others. Just going to make sure I'm at the right point in my PowerPoint. In the meantime, from within the institution, I'm committed to working on exhibitions and other projects that provide access and meaning for visitors, and more importantly ones which prioritise meaningful dialogue and two-way learning in exhibition development stages. It may have taken me a decade to work this out, but being in those spaces is far more enriching than being a minor cog in the insatiable, unforgiving and relentless art machine. For me at times the art machine was exhausting, but that's not that I don't recognise that I'm not still a cog within that space. I don't appreciate its role. I do appreciate its role in supporting sustainability for our people. These cultural spaces are of course intertwined with the art space in a symbiotic and codependent relationship. The work's final destination is the art world, and the operations of the art world enable the artists to continue to make their work. But I think we should all endeavour to find new ways or even new places to share Indigenous art and culture to both commercial and non-commercial audiences. Ways that provide greater context and voice for artists and custodians, and ways that offer unique experiences tailored to Indigenous people as well as non-Indigenous audiences. We need to move past the wunderkammer, the cupboard of curiosity which has entrapped our cultures for so long. I'm just going to play you a little video so I can catch my voice.
This work is structurally it's a chair, a found chair, and I like working with furniture that I find, and as much as I like working with outdoor materials I come upon, and I wanted to create something that contained the story, which is that of Tasmanian Aboriginal children in the first 50 years of post-contact, post-invasion, children that were taken into non-Aboriginal families. I've found about 220 children in that circumstance of that first generations of could be termed stolen children. And one of whom is one of my ancestors. So the children I've represented in the work through the making of spears that are unfinished spears, in that they're tea tree, pointed, so they're sharpened, scraped, not fully scraped, so bark is left on enough so that when I scrape at one end, it's almost like a pencil, left a space to be able to burn in the name of the child. And so sometimes that's just girl X, where a person has a child and refers to an Aboriginal child in their family but doesn't name that child in a record. And these children, these spears are unfinished, much as these children, for me, their lives are unfinished in not understanding if they made it to adulthood and reached their potential. You know, what did become of these people. So the spears are about 8 foot long, and they are gathered into a structure in a way together, placed through the missing seat of the chair. The chair is burnt in a fire to show that there's something.
So, in choosing to omit these voices from our contemporary art spaces and from our fine art displays, who do we disservice? That's my question. We disservice everyone, the artist, the audience, the staff working on these shows. But I think what it does is it kind of steals from the mystery, the glamour, the kind of illusion of art. And is that really the space that Aboriginal people want their work read in? It's an interesting kind of dialogue. So back to the journey, with all of this in mind, where did I head to next? I went to work as a curator of content development for the new museum project of the West Australian Museum, which brought me back to Auckland last year. I spent 2 entire years thinking about the representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in museums, activating spaces for Indigenous communities, and developing Indigenous museological strategies that would see Indigenous people included in all aspects of a museum redevelopment, which, as we know, is not always the case. This included the development of employment strategies to see Aboriginal cultural liaisons working with the team to develop content, strategies for working alongside custodians in sharing cultural knowledge, lived experience, and reanimating and reuniting our collections with communities. These strategies aim to ensuring displays, interpretation, and experiences honour tradition, while simultaneously exploring contemporary context for young people. We wanted to ensure that the new museum would unpack the complexities of Indigenous culture and identity, rather than recreating a pan-Aboriginal identity, which has failed Indigenous people and museums around the world for far too long. In the back of my mind, while I did all of this work with the team, was a strong desire to ensure that all Indigenous people in Western Australia, which is comprised of around 90 language groups across the state, that all people in Western Australia would be able to see themselves, their families and their communities in some way in the new museum, and that these spaces became owned by our people, and that it was our collective and individual voices that animated these spaces as a primary voice, rather than the expected, monotonous museum voice. I feel like I did some really great work there. I had an opportunity to step out of the art world, to step out of the public eye and out of public life for a couple of years, to consolidate my experiences and to think about where to next. Also, it turns out that long game redevelopments, although exciting and full of potential for legacy, didn't quite match my pace, and the sense of urgency that I feel in working with Aboriginal peoples who need things now. Just after I returned home from the museum's Australasia conference in Auckland last year, an opportunity came about that I could not knock back. One where I could actually start using some of these strategies with our people in telling stories. However, no time had been wasted, and if I walk into the new museum on its opening night in 2020, all being well and I still get an invite, and I'm able to see some of the work that I undertook manifest in the displays or the spaces, and to see the stories of families like mine, it will have been the most important investment of my professional career thus far. Now, this brings us to September last year, and I started in that very long role, which I'll say again for you, the inaugural William and Margaret Geary Curator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art and Material Culture for the South Australian Museum. This opportunity was not brought about by a government initiative, although I worked for the South Australian Government. It was brought about by fundraising and the generous support of Dr. Mark Davey, a supporter of the museum. The establishment of this role was a huge step forward for the museum. It was the first time an Indigenous person was working in a senior role with its Indigenous collection since the museum opened in 1860. It's kind of unbelievable, right? It's kind of like just a game of catch-up, but it was a great step forward. So since I started in the role 6 months ago, I've spent more time on country and with community than I had in the previous 2 years. My first week having travelled to Alice Springs, a few weeks later I was in northeast Arnhem Land, helping in the final stages of content development for Yiraki Didgeridoo, The Sound of Australia. This exhibition, which has involved in extensive work with Jalu Gurawiwi, Yungu Yiraki master and custodian, and his family and community, affirms the museum's commitment to sharing stories of Indigenous Australia in ways that reflect Indigenous cultures and realities, and which are founded in two-way learning and meaningful collaboration. All aspects of this exhibition were made alongside Jalu and his family, with our design team hoping to recreate the stringy bark forest of Yiraki, or the place where didgeridoos come from. Visual content was produced both in Arnhem Land and in Adelaide. New Yiraki were commissioned for the exhibition, and old Yiraki, approximately 100 years old within our collection, were tested for various pesticides, and with Jalu's involvement in curation, a selection of Yiraki were placed in a purpose-built rehumidifier so that these instruments, crafted by Jalu's ancestors, could be brought to life again. This is meaningful work that responds to and comes from Indigenous spaces. Museums are cold places, aren't they, really?
He always play from inside. Come the sound of the mandapul. He can hear you. Also Manikai of the Yoruba, because we know how to sing the land, the sea, the star, the sky. We know how to sing, you know.
So Larry is Jalu's son. Jalu's about 90, and Larry is my goro, my poison cousin. So we belong to a kinship structure together. Trees, and so in displaying them we developed structures to hold them and to hold them in the context from which they emerge.
Thank you. Enjoy the activity.
So, Yolngu people have some of the strongest culture, the most undamaged relationship to language, social structure, kinship system, material culture, mark making in Australia. These are those strong cultures that feature in museums. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't. But what I'm saying is that we need to think about the people who are invisible within these spaces. So last but not least, I'd like to speak to you about the main project I'm working on now, Nura, Home in the Nyanadara Lands. It's an exhibition of desert art, artefacts and digital media that explores Nyanadara people's perspectives around place, attachment to country and their unique sense of home, their Nura. Very few Australians have the experience of working with remote communities, and these are places and people that are either highly politicised or highly romanticised. The public rarely have an opportunity to engage with our Aboriginal homelands and the people who live there, and why people are compelled to and obligated to live on their Nura. Nura, Home in the Nyanadara Lands, will share with audiences the story of Indigenous humanity and existence in the experience that will make a dynamic and challenging statement of identity and contemporary belonging to Australia. The exhibition will present ways of living uniquely Australian lives which predate Western notions of modern life, and proposition audiences to consider the varying modes of navigating Australia, its politics, its histories and its realities. This exhibition explores our shared history with food, cars, sport and technology, while highlighting the radically different understandings of place, houses and homes that are held across the nation. From this common ground, the exhibition invites audiences to find familiar touchstones within a world most people imagine to be beyond their understanding. Nura, Home in the Nunatara Lands, invites audiences to consider Nunatara life and people, and more broadly the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their cultures as an integral part of their own cultural and physical landscapes in Australia. Since last September, I have spent about 3 months living and working with communities in the Nunatara Lands, and in 2 weeks' time I will begin another 2-month stint in the lands, continuing to build trust, share stories and create content across 5 communities, which are between 3 to 6 hours drive from each other across desert roads and tracks. Working closely with Arts Centre managers, consultants and facilitators alongside passionate Nunatara people, we will share the stories of their world and share their Nura, their home, with broader Australia.
And, you know, when our kids go away to Warrakuna or Jameson, they say, oh, it's not my place, I'm going back to Babylon. But see, it's their place, it's their Mora. Every kids, everyone, you know, every you know, people that we hear are saying, oh, they say, it's Mangora is Warrakuna, that's why, Madamu, that's Madamu Kumura, my Gabaleko, my mother and father. Everybody saying, like Blackstone, Jameson, Euro-centric. And it's really good to be in your own country, in your own Mora, where you can feel happy, free, and you know it belongs to you. It was then before, you know, it was your grandmothers, grandfathers, your mothers and fathers. Now it's yours. And, you know, when you go anywhere else, it's not home. It's just gone for a visit holiday. But when you come back to your home, Morakoto. Yeah.
I've been trying to do for some time and will continue to do through my professional career as an Aboriginal person first and foremost, working with communities through museums or galleries or wherever else this journey may take me. I've had more jobs in the last 4 years than I've had in my whole lifetime. In rethinking my proposition, can museums be places for Indigenous peoples to share stories of diverse Indigenous experience? I believe the answer is yes, they can. But to do this meaningfully, Indigenous people working on the inside need to be supported to create new processes, to indigenise their practices, to be offered time to speak with their people about what museums have done to us, what they continue to do which hurts us, and what museums and galleries can do to support us and celebrate us. And by that, I mean all of us, not just those who occupy the spaces that are easiest to share with your audiences, but families like mine and families of so many Indigenous people whose stories may be hard to hear, but for us are much harder to share. We as Indigenous peoples within museums and galleries often find ourselves in tenuous situations. We are asked to rationalise and justify our work, cultures and selfhood on a daily basis. We are asked to fight for equal representation in museums built on stolen land, museums who have historically told our stories through the work of non-Indigenous academics, and museums who have acquired our artefacts and in doing so culturally displaced our ancestors, and for many, museums who hold the human remains of their ancestors. To collect us and to employ us doesn't always mean we feel included. At times we feel acquired or documented, like the black subject that museum has gazed upon for so long. Given all of this, the work we do can be heavy, a heavy burden to carry and a weight too heavy for some. Dr. Mark Seeley, a mentor of mine, shared some powerful insight with me when I arrived in London last year on a cultural leadership program. He said to me, when we walk down the street, it is not the job of the people we encounter to make sure that we can see them, but our responsibility as humans, our accountability to try and see and understand the people we encounter, to see more than what the eyes of our own worldviews can offer, to expand our humanity. I believe this is true with museums and galleries working with Indigenous peoples and collections. It is not our job to make you see us, to make you understand our story. We must all be accountable to each other, to seeing each other, and through the work we do, enact and demonstrate true inclusivity and equality within our museums built on the lands of First Peoples and for our communities, as this is our shared social and cultural obligation. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora.